Hello everybody, this is Don Kleski, and today we're going to talk about economics. So here's the objectives for today's lesson. How do businesses and not-for-profit organizations help create our standard of living? What are the sectors of the business environment, and how do changes in them influence business decisions? What are the primary features of the world's economic systems, and how are the three sectors of the U.S. economy linked? How do economic growth, full employment, price stability, and inflation indicate a nation's economic health? How does the government use of monetary policy and fiscal policy to achieve its macroeconomic goals? And what are the basic microeconomic concepts of demand and supply, and how do they establish prices? And what are four types of market structure? What are the four types? And what trends are reshaping the business, microeconomic, and macroeconomic environments and competitive arena? So what I wanted to emphasize right at the very beginning of my lecture here, and this will be the same with all future lectures, my lecture is not a substitute for looking at the PowerPoint that's online for the particular module content, which supports the text, and also reading the text itself. A lot of these lesson objectives I will not cover in detail in my audios that you're listening to. So it's a combination of listening to my online lectures as well as reading the material and looking at the other PowerPoint. So let's just kind of jump right in here and go to the next slide, which talks about the nature of business. So the nature of business, we can kind of break this apart into a couple different segments to talk about. Goods and services. First of all, what is the difference between goods and services? If you are buying a car, right, that's a good. If you're buying groceries at the grocery store, that's goods, right? And if you go to a CPA or an attorney, you'll be buying services generally, right? But there's also a mix between the two. Frequently, when you buy a car, you're not just buying the physical car, but you're also buying, the services that dealership may provide to you, or however you're purchasing the car. Maybe you're buying it online, and so the services are being integral part of that business transaction. So I want you to kind of think that we think of goods and services, but they can be blended together, and frequently are. The nature of business, it impacts our quality of life, right? How business is around us, how we conduct business, definitely impacts our quality of life. Business is about the use of scarce resources. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Business has risk associated with it. Any of you that have tried to open your own business or know somebody who owns a business, you understand that the business operation, the business process can be thought of in terms of risk and rewards. It can be talked about in terms of risk, which impacts both revenue, costs, and profit. So here is my basic economic formula that is very simple, but everything in business management you can tie back to this. And that is that revenue or income minus costs equal profit. Very simple formula to remember. However, when we're looking at business and we're looking at management as we progress through our particular semester, you will find that almost everything we do ties to analyzing or managing parts of that and impacts on that equation. The last thing I want to talk about in this particular slide is for-profit and not-for-profit. When we get into talking about company structure, frequently we will talk as if we're talking about for-profit, and there are companies out there that are structured as not-for-profit. They are actually managed very, very similarly. The difference between the two There's two primary differences between profit and not-for-profit businesses. One is for tax purposes, you're treated differently, and second is that what you can do with what we would term profit, the revenues in excess of your expenses in not-for-profit, basically gets rolled back into the operation. And you can think of some not-for-profit or non-profit businesses that you're familiar with. KPBS is a non-profit organization, and there are many of them. Frequently, the reason why you form a nonprofit organization is because you're trying to achieve something that has more of a social impact to it than just making money. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. All right, the next one is, let's talk about the business environment. There are multiple sub-environments that impact business, and this is the list. The textbook does a pretty nice job going through some of these, but let's just list them out. Economic, political, legal, demographic, social, competitive, global, and technological. And if you think about the businesses that you might follow on or hear about on the news, or that you're familiar with, that you do business with, you can see that all of these different environments have an impact on that particular business. Is the economy, we're going to walk through all of these in a little bit more detail throughout the semester. Today we're really focusing on economic, but obviously political and legal environments impacts it. Demographic is a business that is being done, let's say, in Texas. Is it going to be different than a business that's being run in San Diego? Your customer base is different, right? That's demographic. If it's a business that is focused on teenagers versus a business that's focused on senior citizens, is that different? That's demographic. Social, competitive. Are you in a highly competitive industry or market, or a very non-competitive environment? That will impact you. Are you competing globally, or is it locally? And obviously technological. We're seeing lots of changes in the technology aspect of doing business, and we're going to go through that in more detail later as well. What I wanted to point out is that each of these sub-environments influence our actions and reactions. This is something that I actually love about business and about management. Is it's hard to be bored in management because there are so many different things that are influencing your decision or decisions all the time. Okay, next one. How does business and economics work? Well, it's really all about the allocation of limited resources. So first, let's talk a little bit about what that means. Organizations are trying to best satisfy this unlimited societal need, right? I mean, if you really think about it, consumers, us, generally have a lot of needs, and businesses are always trying to satisfy a need or a want. I want a new car, I want a house, I need clothes, I need food. And so business is all about satisfying needs, and that's actually one of my key personal business philosophies. When you look at that, which I posted, you'll see on there that you never want to lose sight of what the customer desires. That's really important, because ultimately that's what business is about, right? Okay, so factors of production, what are they? Well, natural resources. That would be if I'm building something and I need wood, or I need steel, or I need flour to make something. Those are natural resources, right? Capital. Think of capital as being money, right? We need money to be able to do business, and we're going to talk about where that comes from and some of the implications of that over the semester. HR is abbreviation for human resources, and that's about people, right? We need people to do business, to run it, to factory workers, or people on the counter, sales clerks, all sorts of different things. It's a very key part of management. I love the people management part of business. And entrepreneurship. Okay, that's a long word for saying basically it's the ownership drive to want to be successful and to succeed in running a business. Um, what goods and services to produce and in what quantities? That's part of what we're going to study this semester. How and by whom are these goods and services to be produced, and how do we get them into the hands of the consumer? Goods and services. All of these are components of how we do business, and we're going to go through those in a lot more detail. Okay, so let's talk about, start bringing in a little bit of flavor about what economics means. An economic system is a combination of policies, laws, and choices made by its government to establish the systems that determine what goods and services are produced and how they're allocated. That's the economic system. Okay, economics is the study of that system. The major systems, the major economic systems, which you're familiar with, you may not have thought about it coming at it from this perspective, but the major economic systems are capitalism, which is, let's classify it as an unplanned economy. And then there's planned economies. We're going to talk about that in a sec. Communism and socialism. And then there's a mixture, or mixed economies. So let's focus for a moment on capitalism. Capitalism is based on private ownership, economic freedom, and fair competition. And the core principles that drive that are individual importance, right? And the innovation and hard work. Those are the basic tenets of capitalism. Now, within capitalism, we have different degrees of competition. Pure competition, and then oligopoly and monopoly. And let's just take the two extremes. Pure competition means that basically you supply, the market sets the price and the demand by what it wants and what the price is that you bring it to market. And that's a pure competition environment. There's nothing that's impinging that, right? A monopoly, on the other hand, is where there's basically one supplier and they can kind of charge what they want, right? And there have been many examples of monopolies within this country. Sometimes we choose to kind of use a monopoly structure for the good of society. It used to be phone companies. It was basically one basic phone company in the country. They were structured a little bit differently, but the idea was that it made sense for us to have that as a society. But there were monopolies in I think the steel industry a long time ago, and there are monopolies today. Then there's oligopoly, which is kind of in between the two. It's where there's a very limited number of people or companies that are producing goods, and therefore they have a lot of control over the pricing and what's coming to market. Later on, we'll talk about when we have, now I'm having a moment where I can't remember the name, but where we've got limited groups that control cartels, excuse me, that's what it was, where we have cartels. Cartels are kind of a way that oligopolies function sometimes, and the most clear example of cartels is the oil cartels, which are companies that kind of band together and set prices and supplies to their benefit. And within this country, cartels are illegal. The oil cartels outside of our country are interesting to study because they're pretty obvious, and I think that's it for right now on cartels. Okay, so communism and socialism, they're people kind of think of them interchangeably sometimes, but they're really not. Communism is basically state-owned. Everything is kind of owned by the state, not by individuals. Socialism is kind of sits between capitalism and communism. Socialism is where The government does a lot, takes over a lot of services. For instance, Canada would be a socialistic economic structure. We're talking about healthcare for all. That's a socialistic concept, okay? I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that that's an example of something that is more socialistic than capitalistic, okay? And then the mixed economies, which there are many, and we are one of them. We are not a pure capitalistic economy. We are not a pure socialist economy. We sit in between the two, and that would be a mixed economy. Okay, so macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is the whole. It's the study of a country's overall economic dynamics. So it's the big picture. We're going to contrast that with microeconomics. Macro being large, micro being small, like a microscope. Okay, so I want you to stop and think, and you can pause this audio or this YouTube. You can pause it for a little while and think about it, or you can get all the way through this and come back. But I want you to think about, how does the economy affect you? Personally, how does it affect you? And there's lots of ways, but I want you to really just give some thought to that and maybe make a list. And then I want you to think about, how do you affect the economy? Because you do. And try to think about ways that your actions impact the economy. Okay, now let's step back and let's talk about from a macroeconomics perspective. So we're talking about the whole, how do we as a country try to manage macroeconomics? Well, I like to use the concept of brake and gas pedals, where we can touch the brakes a little bit and we can step on the gas a little bit to pick up speed or slow things down to strive for growth and stability in our economy. We will go through a little bit more detail later on about the economic cycles that we can go through in this country. And those cycles can be very painful to us. And so we use brake and accelerator tools to try to stabilize the economy, to speed it up sometimes, and actually to slow it down a little bit sometimes. So we can do that through a couple of different general concepts or general ways. One is monetary policy. So the ones that we're going to talk about right now are going to be monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is the way that we influence the economy through the money supply. And when we have less money in the system, which is going to sound kind of funny, but there are ways that we do this. When there's less money in the system, it increases pressure on interest rates. And what that does is it has a tendency to slow down the economy a little bit. And there's ways that the government actually can do that. And they can do it through, well, let's first of all talk about how we define money supply. And there's a couple primary measurements of money supply. And you will hear this occasionally in the news or something. Somebody may mention M1 or M2. Okay, M1 is money supply, is number one, and it is basically cash. Oh, there should be a comma there. Cash, checking, traveler's checks. Okay, so this is very, very liquid, like money in your pocket. Okay, and M2 is all of M1, but we also include savings, money markets, and certificates of deposits. Those instruments get included in M2. So you can see M1 is narrow. M2 is a little bit broader because it includes money that's less volatile. Okay, and so how can we influence the money supply? How can we expand it or shrink it? And we do it through the Fed. We call it the Fed, and the Fed is basically bankers' banks. Okay, and later on, I mentioned I would like to have a little conversation about money and banking. And so we'll get a little bit more into the Fed and how that works. But they have tools they use that can push more money into the economy or pull it back, and they do it through open market operations, the discount rates, and reserve requirements. So let's use a simple one. Simple one is reserve requirements. When you go and deposit money into your bank, let's say you deposit $100, every bit of that $100 doesn't get used by the bank. For instance, what do they do with it? Well, they usually loan it out, right? They do things with your money while it's sitting there. But the bank has a reserve requirement where they have to hold a certain amount of their assets or deposits in aside. And the Fed, by just tweaking that a little bit, increasing the reserve requirements a little bit, slows down how much that money can be lent out, or how much it can be lent out, and that has a multiplier effect to it. So a little change can have a fairly good impact on the economy. The other thing is discount rate. Discount rate, remember, it says banker's bank, right? So banks constantly go to the Fed and they'll borrow overnight for money. It's very, very common, borrow short term, and the discount rate is the rate that they charge their banks. Well, obviously, if they raise the discount rate, then banks might be a little bit less quick to borrow, or won't borrow quite as much, and what that does, it kind of has a tendency to push up the interest rates that they're lending. It slows things down just a little bit. So this is the accelerator and brake pedal that the Fed uses. Okay, fiscal policy, that's the opposite, or not the opposite. It's another tool that the government uses, and this is how we influence the economy through taxation and spending. So if you think about it, this gets a lot of press. If we lower tax rates, what do? Well, gee, you're paying less in taxes, so I've got more money in my pocket, so I guess I can go spend it. So by lowering tax rates, the primary place is that it is a more immediate boost to the economy, and people are going to probably spend that money. And the other thing is that, the fiscal policy, they can increase spending, government spending. Sometimes that's very helpful. Sometimes it slows the economy down a little bit. Sometimes it helps kind of get the economy rolling a little bit. When the Fed invests a lot of money in building up military, that means that there's a lot of building and development that's going on in building arms and weapons, and might be building airplanes and ships and things like that, all of which create jobs. So, when you increase government spending, like, we need to build new roads or new railroads, those things all can create jobs and which has again a multiplying effect, right? More people who have work, are probably spending more money buying clothes and food and all those sorts of things. One of the okay, so I'm going to skip what I was just thinking about saying. Okay, key measures. These are some of the measures. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now, but I do want to just mention this so that you're familiar with it. These are some of the measurements that we use to determine how the economy is doing. You'll hear these or see these. GDP, which is gross domestic product. It tells how much we're how well our economy is doing. The employment rate, which is how many people are working versus unemployment. Actually, with the employment rate is really looking at how many people are unemployed. I attached a really good student help to this particular module. I want you to look at that because it kind of tells you how do we actually count or figure what the unemployment rate is. Lots of people come out of the numbers before we actually calculate the unemployment rate. The most important thing to remember out of all of that is the unemployment rate counts the people that are unemployed but are able and looking for work. Okay, if you're not looking for work, you're not counted as unemployed. And so this last major recession that we went through, there was a lot of discussion about, well, wait a sec, the unemployment rate's dropping, but the number of people getting working isn't going up. Why? Well, it's because people are getting discouraged and they gave up looking. So that can be an influencing factor. Okay. So some of these others, business cycles. There are, you can see here, several different business cycles. Contraction, where the economy is slowing down. Recession, which actually has a definition as to how we calculate recession. And depression, which is a very serious depression, or excuse me, a very serious recession. And recovery, where we are coming out of a down cycle, and expansion. All of those can be defined and determined by measurements like GDP. Inflation is how much is what's happening with our dollars or spending dollars. If I am buying a house today and the house is costing $200,000 and over the 10 years, the house costs a lot more, right? Well, that's probably inflation. Our dollar goes less. I'll tell you a great little story. My first house I bought, I paid $26,000 for it. And everybody, when you tell them that, they go, "Oh yeah, that's great! Wow, it's less than you pay for a lot of cars today." The point is how much was I making? Well, I was making like $450 a month, and so gas prices were a lot cheaper, but you're making a lot less. So that's all related to inflation. Okay, let's go on to what do I got here? Okay, we already there. All right, so microeconomics. Micro, small, right? Micro is a subset. It is a smaller portion of macroeconomics, and we are looking at its impact on businesses and consumers. So microeconomics is a study of personal business level economics. What motivates a business? What motivates you? Okay, that's microeconomics. And supply and demand is a subset of what helps make decisions at the microeconomic level, right? And let's assume the book has a really nice little section on that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now, but I want you to look at that and kind of try to understand that. If I am making surfboards, Don's Surfboard Shop, and I've got a price. Let's say it costs me $200 to make a surfboard, and I'm going to sell it for $500. Well, that's a really big profit, but let's just say that's a good example, right? I'm going to sell it for $500, and at $500 price point, maybe I have 25 orders, right? If I lower my price to $400, I have, not 25 purchasers interested, but now I've got 100 purchasers interested. Okay, that's supply and demand. Pricing and quantity impact how many sales and how much revenue you get, and that creates curves and that you can use in business and understanding your pricing. So that's the teaser on that particular subject. We'll probably spend more time on that later on. Okay, so last slide. We're almost done here, but now I just want to talk just for a second about the trends in business and competition. We are in a pretty accelerated rate of change right now in business. Business is always changing. A lot changes, and some things, concepts and management styles really migrate very, very slowly. But the way we do business today is changing very quickly, mostly because of artificial intelligence, data analysis and the use of data, and robotics. Those are the things that are fundamentally changing the way we do business today. And if you think about things that 30 years ago you would go into a grocery store, you couldn't pay if you walked out without going through a checker line. Now, it's commonplace that you can go to a scanner and scan. And Amazon's testing technology where you don't even have anybody that's a checker. You literally walk in, walk through the store, pick up what you want and walk out, or you can put things back down, walk out. It knows exactly what you picked up and taken, and it charges you for those. That technology is happening, and there's pluses and minuses of that too when we talk about social impacts on people and employment and things like that. But also, I like to use the other example of, many years ago, if you wanted business cards, you would go to a print shop and you would they would do a mock-up of it, and then you'd approve it, and then they'd print it. It'd take you for weeks or whatever, and now you can go online and do them, and they'll be there, or you can print them off at home, or you can buy them online, and they'll be delivered to you. If you want to buy cards, you can buy cards online. You can do electronic cards as opposed to the old days of going in and buying paper cards, which are still good. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying the impact of technology changes how we do business, right? I mean, 20 years ago, it was a major feat to try to have something delivered to your house if you bought it. Nowadays, a tremendous percentage of our purchases are done online, delivered to us. And now we're talking about having robotics deliver them to us. Lots of changes. And if you're in business, if you're a small business owner today, pretty hard to figure out how you're going to be in business and be successful with what I would call a bricks and mortar place, a little store, right? If you're not also trying to do something online. Very hard to make the economics of that work. Still can be done, depends on the industry and lots of different factors. But anyway, I hope that this has been very informative to you. And we will move on. Have a great week. Bye-bye.